the dawn's like boots on the ground, the leaves crunch beneath as we head down. There's something about the woods, and for the peace, the quiet, we heed the call. Won't you join me on this trail, dear, where the deer stand tall and the air so clear?
You're listening to my favorite podcast, the Big Buck Registry.
Big Buck Registries.
Big Buck Registry. It's Big Buck Registry.
The Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunt Podcast.
Welcome to another edition of the Big Buck Registry's Deer News, the 2025 wrap-up edition, Deer News you might have missed over the last year. We'll start in New York, where a long-running debate finally ended with crossbows being legalized for deer hunting. From there, we head north to New Hampshire, where hunters saw major changes to what equipment they're allowed to carry into the field. Just south in Connecticut, Sunday hunting expanded, reopening long-standing access conversations. A short jump offshore takes us to Massachusetts, where efforts to manage deer on Martha's Vineyard ran headlong into the state's strict firearm and crossbow laws. From New England, we move west, where pressure on opportunity continues to build. In states like Montana, officials held firm on limiting non-resident deer tags, forcing hard conversations about access as demand keeps rising. Then the story turns to disease and management. At the federal level, new funding was directed toward chronic wasting disease research and response. In Minnesota, that translated into expanded late-season CWD management hunts. In Iowa, it meant broader mandatory testing and reporting requirements. And in Missouri, officials took a step back, reevaluating aggressive disease strategies and ultimately rolling back part of the state's CWD firearm season. From there, we move into how rules change the day-to-day reality for hunters. In Pennsylvania, new restrictions altered how trail cameras can be used during deer season. In Wisconsin, years of CWD pressure continued to test hunter patience. In New Jersey, earn a buck remained a central population control tool. And in Michigan, expanded depredation authority allowed deer to be removed outside traditional hunting seasons. But this year wasn't only about regulations. It was also about research and technology shaping what comes next. New scientific work raised questions about how early chronic wasting disease may begin, including the possibility of transmission before a deer is even born. At the same time, emerging technology showed promise, from thermal detection systems that could dramatically reduce deer vehicle collisions to drone-based surveys offering more accurate ways to estimate deer populations. And finally, we'll look at what happens when the rules are ignored. In Wisconsin, a massive multi-county poaching case ended in sentencing. In Pennsylvania, an organized poaching ring was shut down after years of violations. And in Ohio, the illegal killing of a trophy buck resulted in one of the stiffest penalties the state has ever handed down. We'll close in Maine, where harsh winters and habitat loss reminded everyone that no matter how laws change or technology advances, biology still has the final say. We've got a lot to cover, so let's get started.
Now here's Jim Keller with the Deer News.
New York legalized crossbows for deer hunting in 2025, ending a long-running debate. One of the most significant deer hunting policy changes of 2025 came out of New York, where state lawmakers formally legalized crossbows for deer and other big game hunting during the archery season. The change, signed into law earlier in the year by Kathy Hochul, placed crossbows on equal legal footing with compound and recurve bows, and took effect for the 2025 to 2026 hunting seasons. For decades, New York had been an outlier in the Northeast. While many surrounding states allowed crossbows throughout archery season, New York maintained restrictions rooted in outdated equipment definitions that limited when and how crossbows could be used. The 2025 legislation addressed those rules directly by redefining legal archery equipment statewide. As a result, crossbows became legal anywhere and any time traditional bows were allowed, including archery-only areas. Under the updated regulations enforced by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, hunters were still required to hold a valid hunting license and complete bow hunter education. Existing safety zones, discharge setbacks, and season dates remained unchanged. State officials described the change as a modernization effort rather than an expansion of opportunity. The goal, according to conservation leaders, was to remove unnecessary barriers while maintaining existing biological safeguards. New York, like many states, has faced challenges tied to an aging hunter population. Wildlife managers said expanded crossbow access could help retain hunters' longer and lower entry barriers for new participants without altering season length or harvest limits. At the same time, deer overpopulation remains a concern in parts of the state, particularly in suburban and semi-rural areas where firearms hunting is limited. Officials said broader participation during archery season could help address localized deer density issues while maintaining public safety. Reaction within the hunting community was mixed. Many hunters welcomed the change, calling it long overdue and noting that most neighboring states had already adopted similar rules without negative biological impacts. Others, particularly traditional archers, expressed concern that crossbows introduced mechanical advantages that changed the character of archery season. Lawmakers acknowledged those concerns but pointed to data from other states indicating crossbow inclusion had not led to unsafe conditions or unsustainable harvest levels. Notably, New York did not implement a trial period or partial rollout. The law legalized crossbows statewide without regional exceptions, signaling confidence in existing data and a desire for regulatory clarity. Wildlife officials stated they would monitor harvest trends, participation levels, and compliance as the new rules took effect, leaving open the possibility of future adjustments if warranted by data. As the first seasons under the new law unfolded, New York officially closed one of its longest-running hunting debates. The legalization of crossbows in 2025 marked a turning point in the state's deer hunting history, reflecting broader shifts in hunter demographics, equipment technology, and wildlife management philosophy. And as with all major regulatory changes, the long-term impact would ultimately be measured not in opinion but in participation, harvest data, and herd health.
New Hampshire quietly updated deer hunting rules in 2025, expanding weapon options. While some states made high-profile changes to deer hunting laws in 2025, New Hampshire took a quieter approach, implementing a series of regulatory updates that collectively reshaped how deer hunting works in the Granite State. The changes, which took effect ahead of the 2025 to 26 seasons, were adopted through administrative rulemaking rather than legislation. But despite the low profile, they represented one of the most meaningful updates to New Hampshire's deer hunting regulations in years. Among the most notable changes was New Hampshire's decision to formally allow air rifles for deer hunting under specific conditions. Advances in airgun technology had made modern models significantly more powerful and accurate than those of the past, prompting state officials to revisit long-standing restrictions. The new rules established minimum caliber and performance standards to ensure air rifles met humane harvest requirements comparable to traditional firearms. Wildlife officials emphasized that the change did not relax ethical standards, but rather acknowledged that technology had evolved. At the same time, New Hampshire expanded crossbow allowances during archery season. Previously, crossbow use had been more limited. Under the updated regulations, crossbows became more broadly accessible to hunters who met existing licensing and education requirements, and the changes were administered by the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department, which described the updates as an effort to modernize outdated definitions, improve clarity, and maintain participation, not to increase harvest pressure. Unlike many states grappling with deer overpopulation, New Hampshire has long managed a more fragile deer herd, particularly in the North Country. Harsh winters, limited habitat, and conservative season structures have historically kept deer numbers below management goals in some regions. State officials said the 2025 updates were designed to provide flexibility for hunters without expanding seasons, increasing bag limits, or placing additional pressure on the herd. Reaction among hunters was mixed, but relatively subdued. Some welcomed the added options, particularly those seeking alternatives due to age or physical limitations. Others expressed caution, especially regarding air rifles, questioning enforcement and long-term implications. Traditionalists raise familiar concerns about fair chase and the gradual expansion of weapon types, But those concerns were tempered by New Hampshire's conservative management history and unchanged season structure. Importantly, the 2025 rule changes did not alter season lengths, deer permit quotas, or reporting requirements. The focus remained on how hunters could hunt, not how many deer could be taken, because the updates came through regulatory channels rather than legislation. They drew little national attention. But within the region, they reflected a broader trend of states revisiting decades-old equipment rules and updating them to reflect modern hunting realities. New Hampshire officials stated they would closely monitor participation and harvest data under the new regulations and make adjustments only if biological data supported further change. As the season unfolded, the message from the state remained consistent. Modernization would not override biology. New Hampshire did not dramatically rewrite its deer hunting framework in 2025, but it quietly brought its rules into the present, signaling that evolution in equipment and participation can occur without abandoning cautious, data-driven wildlife management.
In 2025, Connecticut moved to expand deer hunting access in a state where opportunity had long been limited by population density, land access, and public safety concerns. State officials approved an expansion of Sunday deer hunting on private land, marking another step in Connecticut's gradual shift toward increasing hunter opportunity in a heavily developed landscape. The change took effect ahead of the 2025 to 26 deer seasons and applied only to private property. Public land, Sunday hunting remained prohibited. The move came as Connecticut continued to wrestle with persistent deer overpopulation in suburban and semi-rural areas. In many parts of the state, deer densities remained above biological targets, contributing to habitat damage, vehicle collisions, and growing human-wildlife conflicts. Wildlife managers said expanding hunting to Sundays was a way to give hunters more time afield without extending seasons or increasing bag limits. For many hunters working traditional weekday schedules, Sunday had long been the only available day to hunt. At the same time access expanded, Connecticut also tightened its disease prevention rules. Although chronic wasting disease had not been detected in Connecticut deer, the state strengthened carcass transport and disposal regulations to reduce the risk of the disease entering the state. Hunters harvesting deer outside Connecticut faced limits on which carcass parts could be brought back, with high-risk materials required to be disposed of at the harvest location. Officials emphasized that prevention remained the most effective CWD strategy, particularly for states that had not yet detected the disease. The updated rules align Connecticut more closely with regional efforts to slow the spread of CWD across the Northeast. Reaction to the changes reflected the broader challenges of wildlife management in a crowded state. Many hunters welcomed the Sunday hunting expansion, calling it long overdue, and saying it acknowledged modern work schedules and declining participation. Supporters argued that additional access could help manage deer numbers while keeping hunters engaged. Opposition came primarily from non-hunting residents concerned about noise, safety, and the loss of a traditionally hunt-free day. State officials stressed that Sunday hunting was limited to private land and subject to all existing safety zones and discharge laws. The tighter disease rules drew less public debate, but added to ongoing frustration among some hunters who felt regulations were becoming increasingly layered and complex. Taken together, Connecticut's 2025 changes highlighted the balancing act facing wildlife agencies nationwide. The state expanded opportunity with one hand while tightening restrictions with the other. It did not change season lengths, bag limits, or weapon definitions. Instead, it adjusted when hunters could hunt and how disease risk was managed. Connecticut officials said they would monitor participation, harvest data, and public response as the changes took effect, and that any future adjustments would be driven by biological data and public safety considerations. As 2025 came to a close, Connecticut's approach stood in contrast to states facing gridlock or backlash. The state moved incrementally, expanded access carefully, and tightened disease rules proactively. It was another reminder that modern deer management, especially in densely populated regions, is rarely about a single decision, but about constant negotiation between biology, public tolerance, and opportunity.
Massachusetts faced a deer management dilemma on Martha's Vineyard in 2025. One of the most complicated deer management conflicts of 2025 unfolded in Massachusetts, centered on efforts to expand deer hunting opportunities on the islands, particularly Martha's Vineyard, while running headlong into the state's own firearm laws. The issue wasn't whether deer numbers were too high, that part was widely agreed upon. Deer densities on the vineyard had climbed well beyond biological targets, contributing to habitat damage, vehicle collisions, and ongoing concerns about tick-borne illnesses. Wildlife managers acknowledged that existing hunting pressure was not enough to reduce the herd to sustainable levels. The controversy emerged over how to address it. In 2025, state officials and local stakeholders revisited the idea of expanding deer hunting opportunities on the islands, particularly during the late season. Because of housing density and public safety concerns, traditional centerfire firearms were not considered an option. That left muzzleloaders, long viewed as a safer alternative due to limited range, as the primary tool under discussion. But that's where the problem began. Under Massachusetts law, muzzleloaders are legally classified as firearms. That classification triggers the same licensing and permitting requirements as modern guns, including firearms identification and license to carry restrictions. For island residents and visiting hunters alike, those requirements became a major barrier. State officials found themselves in a bind. Wildlife agencies could authorize a deer season, but they could not bypass firearm laws that significantly limited who could legally participate. At the same time, Massachusetts continued to prohibit crossbows for general deer hunting, unlike most surrounding states that had legalized them as archery equipment. That left few practical options. Crossbows, which many other states treat as archery equipment, could have provided a low-range, accessible solution for island deer management. But Massachusetts law did not allow their use, even as pressure mounted to find alternatives to professional culls and sharpshooting. As a result, expanded seasons risked being symbolic rather than effective, open on paper but inaccessible to most hunters who could legally and safely participate. Wildlife officials acknowledged the contradiction. The state wanted to reduce deer numbers, but its own regulatory framework limited the tools available to do so. The situation on Martha's Vineyard highlighted a broader challenge facing wildlife agencies in densely populated regions. Traditional hunting access was limited by land ownership patterns and safety zones. Firearms were heavily regulated, crossbows remained illegal, and non-hunting control methods often faced public opposition. That left Massachusetts trying to balance deer biology, gun law, and public sentiment all at once. Some residents argued that expanding hunting seasons without changing equipment rules would not solve the problem. Others opposed any expansion of hunting at all, regardless of method. By the end of 2025, the issue remained unresolved. Massachusetts had acknowledged the need for stronger deer management on the islands, but the conflict between wildlife goals and firearm law left few viable paths forward. Unlike neighboring states that modernized archery regulations, Massachusetts remained constrained by a legal framework that treated muzzleloaders as firearms and crossbows as prohibited equipment. The result was a deer management problem caught between policy silos. The Martha's Vineyard debate became a case study in how wildlife management can stall when regulations governing how people hunt are disconnected from the realities of where deer live. And as 2025 closed, the question remained unanswered. How does a state reduce deer numbers in places where biology demands action, but the law limits the tools?
In 2025, Montana formally reaffirmed its limits on non-resident deer licenses, maintaining one of the strictest resident priority systems in the West. The decision was finalized as part of the 2025 deer season framework adopted by the Montana Fish and Wildlife Commission, which oversees regulations proposed by Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Under the adopted framework, non-resident hunters remain capped at roughly 10% of the total available deer licenses and were required to draw through Montana's preference point and combination license system. Resident hunters continued to receive priority access to general deer opportunities, with non-residents competing for a limited pool of tags tied to combination licenses. The Commission's action did not introduce a new cap, but it was significant because it came amid continued pressure from non-resident hunters and outfitters seeking expanded access. Demand for Montana deer licenses from out-of-state applicants remained high entering the 2025 season, while resident participation also stayed strong. State officials said the decision was intentional. Commission members emphasized that Montana's system is designed to protect resident opportunity first, while still allowing limited non-resident participation. They noted that increasing non-resident allocation would reduce access for residents and strain public land resources. For non-resident hunters, the outcome meant continued long odds and rising preference point requirements to draw a general deer license. For some applicants, the 2025 framework effectively pushed realistic draw chances several years out. Resident hunters largely supported the decision, viewing it as a reaffirmation of Montana's long-standing position that wildlife access is a resident priority, not a commercial product. The action also carried economic implications. While non-resident hunters contribute significant license revenue, Montana officials reiterated that license allocation decisions are based on access and management objectives, not revenue maximization. By the end of 2025, Montana stood firm as one of the clearest examples of a western state holding the line on non-resident deer hunting pressure. The decision underscored a broader reality in modern deer management. As demand rises and opportunity stays finite, states must choose who comes first. And in Montana, that answer remained unchanged.
In 2025, the federal government took a more assertive role in chronic wasting disease management, signaling a shift in how the nation's most persistent deer disease was being addressed. Congress approved expanded federal funding aimed at CWD surveillance, testing, and research, directing new resources to state wildlife agencies, tribal governments, and federal land managers. The move reflected growing recognition that CWD had outgrown state-by-state solutions. Officials within the U.S. Department of Agriculture said the funding was intended to strengthen early detection, improve testing turnaround times, and support consistent data collection across state lines. By 2025, CWD had been confirmed in deer or elk populations in a majority of U.S. states, with new detections continuing to appear in previously unaffected regions. Speaking publicly about the issue, federal leaders acknowledged that inconsistent surveillance and uneven funding had made it difficult to understand the true scope of the disease. They emphasized that deer do not recognize state borders and that fragmented management had allowed gaps in monitoring and response. Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack described CWD as a long-term threat to wildlife, hunting traditions, and rural economies, noting that sustained coordination, not short-term fixes, would be required to manage it. Federal officials repeatedly stressed that while no cure or vaccine existed, slowing the spread remained a realistic goal. The funding supported expanded testing capacity, interstate data sharing, and continued research into transmission pathways and environmental persistence. Federal scientists said understanding how long infectious material remains in soil and vegetation remained a key challenge, particularly in areas with long-established CWD presence. From a management standpoint, the expanded federal role was designed to support states, not replace them. Officials emphasized that states would retain control over seasons, bag limits, and harvest strategies, while federal agencies focused on coordination, research infrastructure, and disease tracking. The intent, according to agency leaders, was to reduce duplication, close surveillance gaps, and ensure that states with limited budgets were not left behind. Reaction from hunters and conservation groups was cautious. Some welcomed the increased funding, saying states had been carrying the burden of CWD management largely on their own for years. Others expressed concern that deeper federal involvement could eventually lead to standardized policies that ignore regional differences in deer populations, land access, and hunting culture. Those concerns were amplified by growing fatigue over CWD regulations themselves. By 2025, many hunters felt overwhelmed by testing requirements, carcass transport rules, and constantly shifting management zones. Critics questioned whether additional funding would translate into clearer strategies or simply more layers of regulation. Federal officials responded by emphasizing partnership over control. They said the goal was not to dictate how states manage deer, but to provide the scientific and financial backbone needed to make informed decisions. The expanded federal involvement underscored a difficult reality. Unlike traditional wildlife challenges, chronic wasting disease does not respect jurisdictional boundaries. and its slow progression makes it easy to underestimate until prevalence climbs. Managing it requires long-term cooperation across agencies, states, and political lines, even when consensus is hard to maintain. As 2025 came to a close, the federal government's deeper engagement marked a turning point. Whether the increased funding and coordination would meaningfully slow the disease remained uncertain, but the message was clear. Chronic wasting disease was no longer viewed as a regional or experimental issue. It had become a national wildlife problem, with federal agencies now firmly embedded in the response.
Minnesota crossed a significant threshold in its response to chronic wasting disease by authorizing state-managed deer hunts after the regular deer season had already ended. The action was taken by the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, which approved late-season CWD management hunts in narrowly defined areas, where the disease had been confirmed or was considered an elevated risk. These hunts were not extensions of existing seasons. They occurred after all standard archery and firearms seasons had closed, placing them outside the traditional framework most hunters associate with deer hunting. Participation was limited, access was controlled, and every harvested deer was subject to mandatory testing. State officials said the decision reflected both urgency and frustration. By 2025, Minnesota had spent years monitoring CWD through testing, carcass movement restrictions, and targeted harvest strategies during regular seasons. Despite those efforts, detections continued, and officials concluded that waiting until the next fall risked allowing the disease to spread further. The late-season hunts were designed to reduce deer density in specific areas at a time of year when deer were more concentrated and movement patterns were predictable. Officials said that timing increased the likelihood of removing infected animals before they could spread the disease. For many hunters, that rationale made sense, on paper. But the execution raised difficult questions. Critics argued that killing deer outside the established season blurred the line between hunting and population control. Some said it undermined the idea that seasons exist for a reason, and worried that emergency-style actions could become normalized. Others questioned whether the repeated escalation of disease response signaled that existing strategies were failing, and whether hunters were being asked to compensate for a problem that science still struggles to fully understand. Supporters countered that CWD does not follow seasons. They argued that disease management requires flexibility, and that avoiding hard decisions simply to preserve tradition could allow long-term damage to the herd. Some hunters said they appreciated the transparency, even if they didn't like the solution. The late-season hunts also highlighted a deeper tension. Minnesota relies heavily on hunters for disease surveillance, cooperation, and public acceptance of management decisions. By 2025, fatigue was evident. Mandatory testing, carcass rules, shifting zones, and now post-season hunts had stretched patience thin. State officials acknowledged that reality, emphasizing that the hunts were not intended to replace traditional seasons or become routine. They described them as targeted interventions, used only when the risk justified the disruption. As the hunts concluded, attention turned to results. Testing data from the late-season harvest was reviewed to assess whether infected animals had been removed and whether the effort meaningfully reduced disease risk in the targeted zones. Officials said those results would inform future decisions, including whether similar actions would be taken again. By the end of 2025, Minnesota's late-season CWD hunts stood as one of the clearest examples of how far deer management had been pushed by disease pressure. The question facing the state was no longer whether CWD required action. It was how much strain the system, and the hunters within it, could absorb before trust began to erode.
Iowa expanded mandatory chronic wasting disease testing requirements, adding new counties to its surveillance and management zones as detections continued to spread. The action was taken by the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, which announced that additional counties would now require mandatory testing for certain harvested deer during the regular season. The expansion meant thousands of hunters faced new legal obligations. Deer harvested in designated zones had to be submitted for testing at approved collection sites, and in some cases, meat could not be processed or transported until samples were provided. State officials said the decision was driven by new positive detections and growing concern about undetected spread. Iowa has dealt with CWD for years, but by 2025, The disease had reached a point where officials said broader surveillance was unavoidable. The DNR emphasized that mandatory testing was not intended as punishment or deterrence, but as a necessary step to understand where the disease was present and how quickly it was moving. Officials said voluntary participation alone no longer provided enough data to guide management decisions. Reaction from hunters was mixed. Some supported the move, saying mandatory testing was preferable to more aggressive measures, like special seasons or postseason removals. Others expressed frustration, citing longer travel times to testing sites, confusion over changing boundaries, and concerns about delays in processing venison. For many hunters, the expansion added to a sense of fatigue. Testing requirements, carcass movement rules, and evolving management zones had already complicated deer seasons in recent years, and the 2025 changes reinforced the feeling that regulations were becoming increasingly layered. The Iowa decision also highlighted a broader challenge facing states dealing with CWD. Mandatory testing depends on hunter compliance and cooperation. When participation drops or frustration grows, surveillance becomes less effective, the very outcome the rules are designed to prevent. State officials acknowledged those concerns, stating they would continue evaluating testing, logistics, site availability, and communication efforts. They emphasized that the goal was early detection and containment, not long-term mandatory testing across the entire state. As the season progressed, testing data from the expanded zones began feeding into Iowa's broader disease management strategy. Officials said the results would influence future decisions, including whether additional counties might be added or removed in coming years. By the end of 2025, Iowa's expanded mandatory testing stood as another example of how chronic wasting disease continued to reshape deer hunting, not through a single dramatic action, but through incremental decisions that steadily changed how hunters interacted with the resource. It underscored a reality shared by many states. As CWD spreads, the line between surveillance and regulation grows thinner, and the success of any strategy depends as much on hunter trust as it does on biology.
Missouri took a rare step in modern deer management by rolling back part of its chronic wasting disease season framework, signaling a shift away from some of its most aggressive disease-driven policies. The action was taken by the Missouri Department of Conservation, which announced the removal of the special CWD portion of the firearms deer season. That segment had been created specifically to address disease concerns and applied only to counties designated within CWD management areas. The rollback followed years of growing frustration among hunters over increasingly complex regulations tied to CWD. The special firearms portion had added extra season dates, unique rules, and additional layers of compliance that many hunters said were difficult to track and hard to justify. State officials acknowledged that the framework had become too complicated and that participation and cooperation were beginning to suffer. They emphasized that disease management depends heavily on hunter involvement and that overly burdensome rules risk undermining that cooperation. The decision to remove the CWD firearms portion did not mean Missouri abandoned CWD management. Mandatory testing, feeding and mineral restrictions, and targeted surveillance remained in place. But the change represented a clear recalibration, a recognition that not every disease tool was sustainable long-term. For many hunters, the rollback was seen as an admission that the system had gone too far. Some welcomed the move, saying it restored clarity and predictability to the season while preserving the core structure of Missouri's firearms hunt. Others remained skeptical, questioning whether simplifying regulations would meaningfully affect disease spread. The change stood in contrast to actions taken by other states in 2025. While Minnesota escalated its response with late-season CWD hunts and Iowa expanded mandatory testing zones, Missouri chose to step back from a disease-specific season structure that had proven unpopular. State officials framed the rollback as a balance between biology and participation. They said managing CWD requires not only sound science, but also public trust, clear rules, and realistic expectations of hunters. As the 2025 season approached, Missouri signaled that future CWD policy would focus less on expanding season complexity and more on maintaining hunter engagement while continuing surveillance and research. By the end of the year, Missouri's decision stood out as one of the few examples of a state easing, rather than tightening, a disease-driven deer regulation. It underscored a reality many agencies were grappling with in 2025. Even when the science is serious, management strategies must remain workable for the people expected to carry them out. And in Missouri, the rollback marked a clear acknowledgement that effective deer management requires not just rules, but restraint.
Pennsylvania became the center of a national hunting debate after state wildlife officials approved one of the strongest in-season trail camera restrictions in the country. The rule, finalized by the Pennsylvania Game Commission, prohibited the use of trail cameras to aid in the taking of deer while the season was open. The restriction applied during active deer seasons and was aimed squarely at preventing real-time or near real-time monitoring of deer movement while hunting. State officials emphasized the rule was not a blanket ban on trail cameras. Preseason scouting and off-season use remained legal. The change focused specifically on in-season use tied to active pursuit, including checking cameras during the season or using cellular cameras to receive images that could influence immediate hunting decisions. The Commission said advances in camera technology had outpaced existing regulations. Cellular cameras capable of transmitting images instantly had blurred the line between scouting and pursuit, creating both ethical questions and enforcement challenges. According to wildlife officials, conservation officers increasingly struggled to determine whether hunters were making legal decisions without relying on live camera data. The agency argued that real-time surveillance reduced uncertainty in ways that season structures were never designed to accommodate. Supporters of the rule said Pennsylvania was drawing a necessary line to preserve fair chase principles. They argued that hunting had begun drifting toward constant digital monitoring and that limiting in-season camera use helped restore unpredictability and skill as central elements of the hunt. Opposition from hunters was immediate and vocal. Many hunters argued trail cameras had become essential tools for managing limited time afield, especially for those balancing work, family, and aging bodies. Critics said the rule punished responsible hunters while doing little to deter bad actors and questioned whether the restriction was backed by biological data. Others pointed to the rule's reliance on intent, saying phrases like aid in the taking could be interpreted inconsistently. Confusion was compounded for hunters traveling across state lines, where trail camera rules varied widely and continued to change. Despite the backlash, the Commission stood by the decision, stressing that the rule was about defining boundaries before technology advanced even further. Officials said the goal was not to eliminate innovation, but to prevent an escalating arms race between equipment and regulation. By the end of 2025, Pennsylvania's decision had become one of the most cited examples in nationwide discussions about technology and hunting ethics. Other states referenced the rule as they reviewed their own policies, even if they stopped short of adopting similar bans. The trail camera debate ultimately became about more than cameras. It raised fundamental questions about how much technology belongs in the hunt, how agencies balance ethics with enforcement, and how far regulations can evolve before hunters feel disconnected from the process. As with many deer stories in 2025, the issue returned to trust. Trust that rules were grounded in fair chase and practicality, not reaction, and trust that hunters were still being treated as partners in conservation rather than subjects of control. And for many, Pennsylvania's decision marked a clear signal that the future of deer regulations will be shaped as much by technology as by tradition.
Wisconsin once again found itself at the center of a familiar deer hunting debate: how to manage chronic wasting disease without losing the confidence of the hunters expected to help control it. State wildlife officials moved forward with changes to deer management units and season structures, continuing a pattern of regulatory reshuffling driven largely by CWD concerns. For many hunters, it felt like another chapter in a long-running cycle of new maps, new rules, and growing frustration. The changes were administered by the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, which said the updates were intended to simplify deer management, improve disease surveillance, and better reflect regional differences across the state. In practice, the reaction from hunters was mixed. Wisconsin has been dealing with CWD longer than almost any other state, and by 2025, fatigue had clearly set in. Many hunters said they understood the biological threat, but felt worn down by constant regulatory adjustments that seemed to change faster than on-the-ground results. Deer management units were revised again in parts of the state, continuing efforts to align harvest strategies with disease prevalence and population goals. In some areas, that meant targeted emphasis on antlerless harvest. In others, it meant reworking season structures and guidance tied to CWD monitoring. For hunters who had already navigated years of zone changes, special seasons, and evolving rules, the latest updates added to a sense of confusion. Participation concerns lingered in the background. Wisconsin, like many states, relies heavily on hunter involvement for disease surveillance, harvest reporting, and population control. But wildlife officials acknowledged that regulatory overload can have unintended consequences. When hunters disengage, testing participation drops, and management tools lose effectiveness. Some hunters argued the constant changes were eroding tradition and predictability, making it harder to plan seasons and maintain camp culture. Others said the science was sound, but communication and consistency had fallen short. State officials emphasized that the changes were not about increasing pressure on hunters, but about adapting to a disease that continues to challenge conventional management approaches. They pointed out that doing nothing was not an option, even if no strategy offered a perfect solution. The Wisconsin situation echoed themes seen elsewhere in 2025. Like Missouri, the state was grappling with how far agencies can push disease management before public buy-in starts to break. Like states in the Northeast, Wisconsin faced the reality that hunter trust is as critical as harvest data. By the end of the year, the question facing Wisconsin wasn't whether CWD was a problem. That was settled long ago. The question was how to manage it in a way that hunters would continue to support, participate in, and believe in. As 2025 closed, Wisconsin stood as a reminder that deer management doesn't fail all at once. It frays slowly. When rules multiply, maps keep changing, and the people expected to carry the load begin to feel unheard. And in the state where deer hunting is more than a season, maintaining that trust may be the most important management goal of all.
New Jersey reaffirmed and expanded its use of buck requirements, continuing one of the most aggressive deer population control strategies in the country. The policy was maintained and applied across multiple deer management zones by the New Jersey Division of Fish and Wildlife, requiring hunters to harvest one or more antlerless deer before becoming eligible to take an antlered buck in designated areas. Buck has long been controversial in New Jersey, but state officials doubled down in 2025, citing persistently high deer densities, suburban human-wildlife conflicts, and long-standing population goals that had not been met through traditional season structures alone. Unlike many states where population control relies heavily on hunter discretion, New Jersey's approach directly dictated harvest order. Hunters in affected zones could not legally take a buck until antlerless requirements were satisfied. State officials said the policy was necessary. They pointed to ongoing issues with deer vehicle collisions, habitat damage, and public complaints in heavily developed areas where firearms use is limited and access is fragmented. In those landscapes, wildlife managers argued that voluntary antlerless harvest had not been sufficient. Reaction from hunters was predictably mixed, and in many cases openly hostile. Critics argued that buck punished participation by forcing hunters to pass legal bucks, discouraged youth and new hunters, and reduced overall satisfaction. Some said the requirement made deer hunting feel more like a control program than a recreational pursuit. Others questioned whether the policy aligned with hunter retention at a time when participation is already under pressure. Supporters of the program countered that New Jersey's situation is fundamentally different from rural states. With dense human populations and limited land access, they argued that aggressive herd reduction was the only realistic option. Unlike temporary disease measures or experimental seasons, buck in New Jersey was not framed as a short-term tool. By 2025, it had become a core component of the state's deer management strategy. That permanence was what made the story stand out. While other states adjusted, paused, or rolled back controversial policies in 2025, New Jersey reaffirmed its commitment to direct population control, even in the face of sustained hunter opposition. State officials said they would continue monitoring harvest data and population trends, but gave no indication that buck would be removed in the near future. As 2025 came to a close, New Jersey stood as one of the clearest examples of a state prioritizing biological targets over hunter preference. A reminder that in high-density, high-conflict landscapes, deer management often looks very different than it does elsewhere, and for hunters it reinforced a hard truth. In some states, participation is encouraged, but control comes first.
Michigan quietly expanded the scope and use of Deer Damage and Depredation Authority, allowing more deer to be legally killed outside of the regular hunting seasons. The changes were implemented by the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, which updated guidance and permitting practices related to agricultural damage and nuisance deer complaints. Under the expanded approach, farmers, landowners, and authorized agents were given greater flexibility to remove deer that were causing crop damage or property conflicts, even when no recreational deer season was open. In some cases, deer could be taken at times of year when licensed hunters were otherwise prohibited from hunting. State officials said the move was driven by ongoing agricultural losses and persistent deer conflicts, particularly in areas where traditional hunting pressure had not sufficiently reduced damage. They emphasized that depredation permits were not new, but that their use had increased and become more clearly defined in 2025. Unlike standard hunting seasons, deer removed under depredation authority were not taken for recreation. The goal was immediate problem resolution rather than population management through licensed harvest. For some hunters, that distinction was hard to ignore. Critics questioned why deer could be killed under damage permits while recreational opportunity remained limited by season dates and tag availability. Some argued that expanded depredation authority effectively shifted deer removal away from hunters and toward landowner-driven control. Others defended the approach, saying agricultural losses require timely action and that waiting for hunting seasons is not always practical. Supporters noted that depredation permits are narrowly issued and tied to specific complaints, not general population reduction. The expansion highlighted a growing tension in modern deer management. As deer increasingly occupy agricultural and suburban landscapes, states are relying more heavily on non-seasonal removal tools to address conflicts. In Michigan, that meant acknowledging that recreational hunting alone was not solving every problem. State officials maintained that depredation actions would continue to be monitored and adjusted based on need. They emphasized that the authority was not intended to replace hunting seasons, but to address situations where damage could not wait. By the end of 2025, Michigan's expanded use of deer depredation permits stood as another example of how deer management was evolving beyond traditional season structures. It raised a fundamental question for hunters and managers alike. When deer can be legally removed outside the season for damage control, how should opportunity, access, and participation be balanced within the hunting framework? And in Michigan, that question was no longer theoretical. It was already playing out on the ground.
Chronic wasting disease may begin earlier than previously thought. New research published in 2025 added an unsettling layer to what scientists understand about chronic wasting disease in white-tailed deer. For years, CWD transmission was believed to occur primarily through direct contact between animals or exposure to contaminated environments. But a peer-reviewed study examining tissue samples from infected does and their offspring found evidence suggesting that CWD may be transmitted from mother to fawn before birth. Researchers detected abnormal prion proteins associated with CWD in fetal tissues, indicating that infection may begin during gestation rather than only after birth. While the study stopped short of proving that all exposed fawns will develop the disease, it strongly suggested that vertical transmission is biologically possible. If confirmed through further research, the finding could help explain why CWD continues to persist and spread, even in areas where aggressive harvest and testing programs are in place. For wildlife managers, the implications are significant. Management strategies have largely focused on reducing adult deer densities and limiting contact among animals. Vertical transmission would mean that some deer could already be infected before ever interacting with a herd. Scientists caution that this research does not change food safety guidance and does not suggest immediate changes to current regulations. Instead, they emphasize that understanding how early CWD can establish itself is critical for long-term disease modeling and response planning.
Thermal imaging research shows near-perfect accuracy detecting deer near roadways. Researchers working in transportation safety and wildlife management published findings that could significantly reduce deer vehicle collisions. Using thermal imaging paired with machine learning models, scientists developed a system capable of detecting deer near roadways with extremely high accuracy, even at night, in fog, and in poor weather conditions. The system was trained to recognize the heat signatures and movement patterns of deer, distinguishing them from other animals and background noise. In controlled testing environments, detection accuracy approached near perfect levels, with the system consistently identifying deer before they entered roadways. Researchers noted that traditional collision mitigation tools, signage, fencing, and seasonal warnings rely heavily on driver behavior. Thermal detection systems, by contrast, can actively alert drivers or integrate into vehicle safety systems in real time. For wildlife managers, the technology represents more than traffic safety. Deer vehicle collisions influence public perception of deer populations and often drive pressure for population reduction in suburban and semi-rural areas. By reducing collisions without relying solely on lethal management, this technology could become an important part of future integrated deer management strategies, particularly in high-conflict zones where hunting access is limited. While the system is still in the research and pilot phase, scientists said the technology is scalable and could be incorporated into roadside infrastructure or future vehicle platforms.
Drone-based surveys may change how deer populations are measured. Another 2025 study focused on a long-standing challenge in deer management: accurately estimating population size. Researchers tested drone-based survey methods using thermal sensors and automated image analysis to count deer across large landscapes. The results showed that drones were able to detect deer with accuracy comparable to, and in some cases better than, traditional ground surveys and aerial flights. Unlike manned aircraft, drones can fly lower, slower, and at targeted times of day when deer are more visible. Thermal sensors allow detection even in heavy cover, reducing one of the biggest sources of error in population estimates. The study also found that drone surveys required fewer personnel, reduced cost over time, and minimized disturbance to wildlife compared to repeated ground efforts. For wildlife agencies, more accurate population estimates translate directly into better decision-making, from setting tag numbers to evaluating disease pressure and habitat capacity. Researchers caution that drones are not a universal solution and won't replace boots-on-the-ground biology. However, they concluded that drone-based surveys could become a powerful complementary tool, especially in areas where access is limited or terrain makes traditional surveys difficult. As technology continues to evolve, tools like this may quietly shape how deer seasons are set long before hunters ever see a regulation booklet.
Wisconsin closed one of the most disturbing deer poaching cases in recent memory, with the sentencing of a woman involved in the illegal killing of more than 100 deer across multiple counties. 37-year-old Jessica Croning of West Bend, Wisconsin, was sentenced for her role in a large-scale poaching scheme that spanned Fond du Lac, Washington, and Dodge counties. According to investigators with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, the poaching occurred over roughly a year and involved repeatedly shooting deer at night by spotlighting them from a vehicle, one of the most serious violations of Wisconsin wildlife law. Authorities documented the illegal killing of more than 100 deer. The case drew additional scrutiny because juveniles were involved. Prosecutors said Croning allowed minors, including her own son, to participate in the illegal activity and failed to stop it, despite knowing the actions were unlawful. Those juveniles were prosecuted separately in juvenile court. When the case reached sentencing in 2025, a Washington County judge imposed jail time, fines, and license revocations. Croning was sentenced to 1 month in jail, fined, and had her Wisconsin hunting privileges revoked for 3 years. Prosecutors described the case as egregious, citing both the scale of the illegal harvest and the involvement of minors in repeated night hunting violations. Wildlife officials said the volume of deer killed far exceeded what is typically seen, even in serious poaching cases. The DNR emphasized that this was not an isolated mistake or a single bad decision, but a sustained pattern of illegal behavior that undermined deer management, conservation funding, and ethical hunting standards. For Wisconsin hunters, the case hit hard. Wisconsin is a state with a strong deer hunting tradition, and large-scale poaching is viewed as one of the most damaging crimes against that tradition. Ethical hunters follow seasons, limits, and fair chase principles, and cases like this reinforce why enforcement exists. State officials also credited tips and cooperation from the public as critical to building the case, urging hunters and landowners to continue reporting suspected poaching activity. As 2025 came to a close, the Croning case stood as one of the clearest reminders that poaching is not a victimless crime. It strips opportunity from lawful hunters, damages public trust, and erodes the conservation system that deer management depends on. And in Wisconsin, the message from the court was unmistakable. When violations reach this scale, the consequences will follow.
Pennsylvania closed a major organized deer poaching case that resulted in convictions, heavy fines, and decades of combined hunting license revocations. The case was prosecuted following a lengthy investigation by the Pennsylvania Game Commission into a coordinated night hunting operation centered in Cambria County. Investigators determined that 8 individuals illegally killed white-tailed deer over multiple seasons using spotlights and firearms after dark. Officers documented repeated violations that included shooting deer from vehicles, exceeding legal harvest limits, failing to tag deer, using out-of-state tags on Pennsylvania deer, and taking bucks that did not meet legal antler restrictions. The investigation began after a routine license check in 2024 led to an admission of illegal night hunting. That encounter triggered multiple search warrants and uncovered a pattern of coordinated poaching across county lines. In 2025, all 8 defendants pleaded guilty to multiple summary offenses related to the unlawful taking of wildlife. Among those convicted were Jason Wise, who pleaded guilty to 7 counts, was fined more than $6,000, and lost his hunting privileges for 10 years. Sandra Wise, who received a 4-year license revocation and fines, and Daniel Wise, who received a 6-year revocation. Other defendants, Isaac Keith, Dan Sotomont, Marina Morgan, Dennis Corson, and Levi Corson, were each convicted on multiple counts and received significant fines and long-term hunting and trapping license revocations. Several lost their privileges for 10 years or more. In total, the group was ordered to pay more than $35,000 in fines and restitution. Combined hunting license revocations across all defendants totaled more than 70 years. Wildlife officials described the case as one of the more serious poaching operations prosecuted in Pennsylvania in recent years, citing both the scale of illegal harvest and the use of spotlighting, a method considered especially dangerous due to the risk it poses to landowners, motorists, and nearby residents. For Pennsylvania hunters, the case was a stark reminder that organized poaching is not a matter of confusion or ignorance, but deliberate and repeated lawbreaking. Officials emphasize that such cases undermine deer management, damage public trust, and threaten the conservation system funded by lawful hunters. The Game Commission credited tips from the public as critical to building the case and encouraged continued reporting of suspected poaching activity. As 2025 came to a close, the outcome sent a clear message in Pennsylvania. When illegal deer hunting becomes organized and persistent, enforcement follows with consequences that last for years, not just a season.
Ohio closed one of the most serious trophy deer poaching cases in state history with the sentencing of a man responsible for the illegal killing of a high-profile trophy buck. The case involved Christopher J. Alexander, a 28-year-old from Wilmington, Ohio, who was convicted in Clinton County for unlawfully taking an 18-point white-tailed buck and then attempting to conceal the crime. According to investigators with the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, the deer was killed outside the legal hunting framework in November 2023. Officials determined that Alexander did not have legal authorization to take the deer and later engaged in a series of actions intended to mislead authorities about how the buck was harvested. The investigation revealed that Alexander falsified information, tampered with evidence, and involved others in an effort to legitimize the illegal kill after the fact. Wildlife officers documented multiple violations tied not only to the unlawful taking of the deer, but to deception intended to evade enforcement. The buck itself was classified as a trophy class animal, and its antler score placed it among the most valuable white-tailed deer ever involved in an Ohio poaching case. When the case reached sentencing in 2025, the penalties reflected that severity. Alexander pleaded guilty to 14 counts, including wildlife violations, falsification, evidence tampering, and related offenses. The court sentenced him to jail time, with a portion suspended, and ordered 5 years of community control. Most notably, the court imposed approximately $40,000 in restitution to the Ohio Wildlife Fund for the illegally taken deer, the largest single deer restitution amount in Ohio history. Additional fines and court costs brought the total financial penalty into the tens of thousands of dollars. Alexander's hunting privileges were revoked for a minimum of 10 years, with the revocation tied to full payment of restitution. Until that obligation is satisfied, he remains barred from legally hunting in Ohio and other states that honor reciprocal license suspensions. The case also involved accomplices. 3 additional individuals, including Alexander's sister, were convicted on related charges and received penalties ranging from license revocations to fines and community control, underscoring that the poaching effort was not a solo mistake, but a coordinated attempt to bypass the law. Ohio officials emphasized that the case was about more than one deer. Trophy bucks represent years of genetics, habitat conditions, and regulated management. When one is taken illegally, the loss is borne by every lawful hunter who plays by the rules and funds conservation through licenses and excise taxes. For Ohio's hunting community, the case drew widespread attention because of the scale of the restitution and the length of the license revocation. It reinforced Ohio's long-standing position that trophy poaching will be prosecuted aggressively and punished in a way that removes any incentive to break the law. As 2025 came to a close, the Alexander case stood as a clear statement from Ohio. An illegally taken trophy is not a prize, it is evidence, and the consequences follow the offender for years, not just a season.
Maine wildlife officials publicly acknowledged significant losses to critical deer wintering areas, raising renewed concern about the long-term stability of the state's deer herd. The issue centered on the condition and availability of deer yards, dense softwood stands that whitetails depend on to survive severe northern winters. Following consecutive winters marked by deep snow, extended cold, and reduced shelter quality, state biologists confirmed that deer survival had declined in several regions. The Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife said the losses were not the result of a single storm or event, but the cumulative impact of winter severity combined with long-term habitat degradation. Deer yards in Maine are not optional habitat. Without adequate shelter, deer expend critical energy reserves simply to move and feed, leaving them vulnerable to starvation, predation, and exposure. Officials noted that in areas where yard quality had declined, deer mortality increased sharply during prolonged snow cover. The situation drew attention because Maine's deer herd has struggled to rebound for years. Unlike many states dealing with overpopulation, Maine's challenge has been maintaining stable numbers in the face of harsh climate conditions and shrinking winter habitat. Biologists emphasized that hunting pressure was not the driver of the decline. Instead, they pointed to habitat loss from forest management practices, fragmentation, and development that reduced the availability of mature softwood cover. For hunters, the acknowledgement was sobering. In many parts of Maine, deer sightings had already declined noticeably, and the confirmation of yard loss explained why recovery has been slow even in areas with conservative harvest strategies. State officials said protecting and restoring deer wintering areas would remain a priority, but acknowledged that recovery would take time. They stressed that habitat work operates on a much longer timeline than seasonal regulation changes. By the end of 2025, Maine's deer yard losses stood as a reminder that not all deer challenges can be managed with seasons, tags, or enforcement. In the far north, winter still dictates outcomes. And in Maine, the condition of deer yards, not regulations, remain the single most important factor shaping the future of the herd.
As we wrap things up, it's clear that 2025 wasn't defined by one single change in deer hunting. It was defined by dozens of decisions, discoveries, and consequences spread across the country. We saw access expand in places like New York, New Hampshire, and Connecticut, while other states ran headfirst into legal and cultural limits. We watched Western states hold firm on who gets opportunity when demand keeps rising. And we heard how disease management continued to evolve, sometimes pushing forward, sometimes pulling back, as agencies tried to balance biology with participation. We also saw how those decisions played out on the ground. From trail cameras to earn a buck, from depredation authority to season structure, hunters were asked to adapt, sometimes again and again, to a moving landscape of rules. At the same time, science and technology offered a glimpse of what may be coming next. Research into chronic wasting disease raised new questions about how early infection may begin. Emerging tools showed promise, from detecting deer near roadways to estimating populations in ways that could change how seasons are set long before hunters ever see a regulation booklet. And then there were the reminders of where the lines still are. Poaching cases in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Ohio made it clear that when those lines are crossed, the consequences are real, lasting, and severe. In the end, Maine brought the year into focus. Harsh winters and shrinking habitat reinforced a truth that applies everywhere. No matter how laws change, how technology advances, or how management adapts, biology still sets the boundaries. Taken together, these stories tell us exactly where deer hunting stands right now. Not where we hope it's going, not where we fear it might go, but where it actually is. Those were the deer stories that shaped the year. Before we move on, we want to take a few minutes to explain what we've been building here at Big Buck Registry and why it all exists. BBR has always been about more than just recording podcasts. From the beginning, the goal was to preserve deer hunting stories, share reliable information, and give hunters context for what's happening across the country. Over the past year, that idea took a more complete form with the launch of the new Big Buck Registry website and a renewed focus on how everything fits together. The website is designed to be a central hub. It's where listeners can find podcast episodes, deer news coverage, and long-form resources in one place without having to chase social feeds or outdated posts. The focus wasn't on adding noise. It was on organizing information so it's easier to use. A major part of that effort has been building tools specifically for deer hunters. One of those tools is the BBR Weather app. BBR Weather is a hunter-first forecast, not a general weather app. It focuses on the conditions hunters actually pay attention to in the field: wind direction, pressure changes, temperature swings, timing, and trends, without clutter or unnecessary data. The goal is to help hunters understand what the weather is doing and how it's changing, not just what the temperature happens to be. Built on top of that foundation are two separate deer movement tools. The first is Deer Move by Weather. Deer Move by Weather looks at how weather variables line up over time, pressure trends, temperature shifts, wind, and timing, and presents them in a way that helps hunters think about when conditions may be worth paying attention to. It doesn't predict deer, and it doesn't guarantee success. It provides context so hunters can make more informed decisions about when to hunt. The second tool is Deer Move by Moon. Deer Move by Moon isolates lunar and solunar data for hunters who track moon phase, overhead and underfoot times, and daily lunar influence. Instead of mixing moon data into a generic forecast, this tool keeps it clean and focused, allowing hunters to decide for themselves how much weight to give lunar timing. These tools are intentionally separate. Some hunters rely heavily on weather, some pay close attention to moon data, some use both. By keeping BBR Weather, Deer Move by Weather, and Deer Move by Moon distinct, hunters can use exactly what fits their style without being forced into a single formula. Beyond tools and data, the website also reflects a return to something that built Big Buck Registry in the first place: conversations. We're jumping back on the mic with more interview-style episodes, sitting down with hunters, biologists, land managers, and industry voices to capture stories, lessons, and perspectives that don't fit into a headline or a news segment. To support that, the site now includes a Suggest a Guest page, where listeners can recommend people they think are worth hearing from: guides, wardens, researchers, or everyday hunters with a story to tell. It's a way for the audience to help shape the conversations we're having. The site also includes a way for hunters to submit a buck they're proud of. Through a simple form, listeners can share photos and basic details for use on social media and future features. It's another way the community becomes part of the platform, not just an audience listening in. In addition to those, we've built out pages that support the long game: podcast directories, deer news archives, evergreen episode collections, and state-level reference pages that don't disappear after a single season. These pages exist so information stays useful, searchable, and relevant over time. When we talk about regulations changing, disease management expanding or rolling back, access tightening or opening up, or enforcement making headlines, the goal is to give hunters somewhere to go next, not just something to hear and forget. Everything we've built follows the same philosophy. We're not trying to tell hunters how to hunt. We're not trying to predict deer with certainty. And we're not trying to replace experience in the woods. What we are trying to do is give hunters better information, clearer context, and tools designed specifically for how deer hunters actually think, plan, and talk to each other. All the stories you've heard in deer news, rule changes, access debates, disease response, enforcement actions, and biological limits don't exist in isolation. The website, tools, and community features are designed to help connect those dots. That's what the new Big Buck Registry platform is about. And this is just the foundation we're building on. So check out bigbuckregistry.com, report a poacher, suggest a guest or a podcast, get the weather, deer movement predictions using weather or moon tools. Directly, it's bigbuckregistry.com/weather, bigbuckregistry.com/deermoon, and bigbuckregistry.com/deermove.
That concludes this edition of the Big Buck Registry's Deer News. If you have any ideas for future topics or have questions about any of these topics, please email me at jim@bigbuckregistry.com.
I'm Dusty Phillips.
I'm Jim Keller.
And I'm J. Scott Ammon. And thank you for tuning in to the Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunt podcast. We can be found on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you would like to support us and find value in what we do here, whether it's the podcast, the blog posts, our social media posts, or any of our new apps, please consider donating to the cause by visiting www.bigbuckregistry.com/donate or buy some merchandise at bigbuckregistry.com/merch. As mentioned earlier, our website has been revamped at bigbuckregistry.com. Our weather app is bigbuckregistry.com/weather. Our deer movement app is at bigbuckregistry.com/deermove. And our moon-based app is at bigbuckregistry.com/deermoon. Submit a guest suggestion for a podcast at bigbuckregistry.com/guest. Submit a buck pick at bigbuckregistry.com/buckpick. And if you would like to report a poacher through the Hunt Regs app, go to bigbuckregistry.com/poacher. See you next time on the Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunt podcast. And until then, stay safe, shoot straight, and good luck in the deer woods.
As we move on with hearts so strong, echoes of nature sing our song. In every rustle, a story's told of days gone by and hunts of old. Listening close to Deer Hunt by the Big Buck Registry, sharing tips and tales, it's where we ought to be.